I might be qualified to talk about it. First of all, I started to get acquainted with wrestling through scouting. And it was in those years that I learned from a couple of varsity wrestlers who were in our scout troop. Not long after that, I started wrestling a little bit in seventh grade and eighth grade. And as I got to high school, at Rock Island High School in Illinois, the Rocks, I had two just phenomenal high school. And one of them was my boyhood hero, Bill Smith, who had won the Olympics in 1952 in Helsinki. And Coach Smith was just an icon to all of us boys at the time. And as I said, my hero. And one of the things that he taught us, among many things, and kind of beyond wrestling, was that we needed to be evangelists and promoters of the sport. And his great line at the end was, if not us, who? And it was something that sort of stuck with me for the rest of my life. And so he would send us out to middle schools, grade schools, Kiwanis clubs, Rotary clubs, we do demonstrations. And that kind of ingrained in me the idea of taking the wrestling out of the wrestling room into the public. In college, I was fortunate to have two coaches who had the same philosophy. So they trotted me out to, again, all of these organizations and schools, and I did clinics, and I did demonstrations in front of the Women's League. I did demonstrations in front of Kiwanis clubs and men's organizations. And so that was just part of my training in the early years, the formative years. In grad school, where I ended up at the University of Kansas, so I wrestled at Augustana College in Illinois, and I wanted to be close to home. One of my parents has seen me wrestle. And so then I went to the University of Kansas, where I continued my wrestling and post-grad, and also was the head coach at the University of Kansas. But again, I troubadoured all from Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas City, Kansas, all the way to Topeka, Kansas, and all the middle schools in between to sell the sport of wrestling at the time. So time went by. Spent a little time in Iowa, worked with a high school team there in Fairfield, Iowa, and Pearl Smith, who was a coach. Ended up in Madison in 1966. And I came to Channel 27, and right down the road was the West YMCA, where I worked out all the time. I decided, why not start a youth wrestling program at the Y? So I did, and a lot of those young men that I had during those years, 20 years of it, ended up really enjoying wrestling, having great experiences, not only in high school, but in college later on. A couple of my guests here today, which should be introduced at this time because it kind of ties into the story. My wife, Sandy, and if any of you have ever been to a wrestling match with Sandy, you'll get an education, I'll tell you, very quickly. Because she knows the sport and she's vocal about it. And when Dwayne's longtime wife, Mona Cohen, was alive, the two of them would sit in the stands and you could hear their voices all over the field house. But she's an interesting one. At national tournaments, she's up on her feet and she's yelling at the officials mainly, and then some of the referees.
Those stripes get me.
Greg Schrader, right here. Greg, raise your hand. Greg is a state champion for Madison West High at 105 pounds. Actually wrestled with my son at West, although Greg was ahead of Todd in school. Greg, from time to time, would sneak down in my basement and work out on that Westview Lane from time to time. And then, of course, there's the coach, Dwayne Club. I'll come to and talk about a little bit later, but what a remarkable man he's been for Wisconsin wrestling. So that's sort of typifies the background, with one exception, is that when Dwayne Cleveland became coach in 1970, and we'll get back to that story, but when he became coach in 1970, I had been doing a lot of officiating, and I've been doing a lot of Big Ten stuff, and I was starting to travel a lot in business, and I was worried I was going to miss a meeting. So somehow I was fortunate enough to become the PA announcer for Badger Wrestling. And I laugh and I joke with people. I held that post for 30 years, mainly because I had the best seat in the house. I had to work directly, of course, with Coach Cleveland and Hellickson, and those were challenging times because sometimes he didn't like to tell you much before a match, so it was interesting times. But I enjoyed it, and that's where I became very familiar with our wrestlers and very familiar with all of these national champs I'm going to talk to you about today. Well, let's get on to the story of Wisconsin wrestling. Now, here's some background. Wisconsin is in its 111th year. Why we don't wear patches to celebrate how long we've been in wrestling, I don't know. But then again, I don't have any say over all of that. But it's 111 years of wrestling. It started in 1911. We've had 65 All-Americans for Wisconsin, 18 individual NCAA champions. Some of them are multiple champions, but that's 18 titles. We've had 68 Big Ten champions and 5 academic All-Americans. The whole story of Wisconsin wrestling has that long history, but probably the guy I'm going to start with is George Martin, who became head coach in 1935 and was here until 1970 when he passed away in a canoeing accident, tragic death, and then Dwayne Cleveland was hired. I'll get to that. But George Martin was a phenomenal wrestler in his day. He was a 165-pound NCAA champion. Many thought that he was really Olympic caliber all the way. Ended up here at Wisconsin. He had 181 victories in Wisconsin during his time. Now, the interesting story is that he went into the service. He was a naval officer. And so the time that he was in service, we had a couple of other coaches. So we had 7 coaches prior to George Martin from 2011 to when he took over in 35. And then he was away doing his naval duty. And we had 2 other coaches. One of them was a pretty famous guy, John Roberts, who was the head of the WIA, coach for a time. He wrestled at Wisconsin, was an All-American. And then George came back from the service and resumed his coaching career at Wisconsin, but 181 victories. He is largely thought of as the father of Wisconsin wrestling, and he troubadoured, much like my former coach Bill Nelson would have done. He troubadoured all over the state and sold the sport to high schools and the young people. And so George Martin is really the father of Wisconsin wrestling, or largely considered that. And we lost him in that canoeing accident, but Elroy Hirsch had the presence to go find a duel when he found Dwayne Cleveland. It had been recommended to Hirsch by a number of people that he should consider Cleveland. One of the prominent ones was, again, John Roberts. Dwayne was hired by Crazy Legs in 1970 and had a vision for Wisconsin wrestling. He came here out of Stoughton High School, where he was again coached by some really great high school coaches. Wrestled for Wisconsin and ended up at Racine Park High School, where he had 2 state championship teams and some really outstanding individuals. But his team hallmark was they were very gifted at takedowns. And And then he went on to UW-Oshkosh, was only there for what, a year, I think, coach, year and a half, when Elroy came knocking at the door, and the Crazy Legs hired him. But what Dwayne brought to the program was a new energy, excitement. He was skilled in the takedown aspect of wrestling. And then he was fortunate enough to have a guy who had just wrestled for Wisconsin, also from Stoughton, by the name of Russ Hellickson, who was his assistant. Started as a graduate assistant and became a full-time assistant for Dwayne. And between the two of them, we were off to the races with great things happening in the decade of the 70s. And you'll learn about these outstanding competitors that they brought to the scene during those years. But I will say this, that if George Martin is the father of Wisconsin wrestling, Dwayne Clevin lit the fuse and got the spark going when he came to be a Badger. And he has red blood running through him, and that's all Badger blood, I'll tell you that. He's still with the university. He's an emeritus professor there, and we're lucky to still have him in the program. Russ Hellickson followed Dwayne as a head coach. Dwayne went for 12 years, 25 All-Americans, the 9 national champions. He was named the NCAA Coach of the Year. He was named the Federation Coach of the Year, and he was inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame for lifetime service. So I could go on and on. He's been awarded everything, but he really was the spark that lit the fuse that got us going in Wisconsin. Russ Hellickson followed Dwayne and was here for a short time, he was here for 12 years with Dwayne, and then he was here as head coach from 83 to 86. Russ was again a Stoughton product. And you're going to smile when I tell you about this because there's a big Stoughton connection here. But Russ was from Stoughton, had a good high school career, came here to play football and wrestle. And he had a good college career, but not at the level that some of these fellows I'm going to talk about. But what Russ did is he because Dwayne Clevin allowed him to do a lot, he flourished as a postgraduate wrestler. And in fact, he won 12 U.S. national championships, 12. He won a couple of world medals, both in the bronze and the silver. And then in 76, Coach Clevin and I slept in a car overnight to watch Russ win the silver medal in Montreal. He had one of the greatest wrestlers in Russian history, Yargin. He had him exhausted, tired, but time ran out. Or Russ would have been a gold medalist. You know, it was a tremendous meet for Wisconsin products because we had the Petersons winning gold and silver, and we had Russ winning silver. So it was quite an Olympics in 76 in Montreal. Russ was a distinguished member of the National Wrestling Hall of Fame in '89. He was inducted in the Hall of Fame. We have pictures of all of these, but I'll just hold one up for Russ here, just so you see it. I'm so sorry for our pal over here who did such good work, but these are the granite plaques that are in Stillwater, Oklahoma, that display those that are entered into the Hall of Fame. And Russ is there in '89. So along comes Andy Ryan. Now the connection. First Dwayne Clevin from Stoughton, then Russ Hellickson from Stoughton, and then Andy Ryan from Stoughton. So obviously Stoughton has a rich history with Wisconsin wrestling. And I won't talk a lot about Andy Ryan as a coach because I'm going to come to Andy Ryan as a competitor, but there's his plaque, his granite plaque in the Hall of Fame. And he was inducted last year, and he now all of the 86 Olympians that wrestled in the Olympics in Los Angeles, they're all entered into the Hall of Fame. Sandy and I watched Andy and Barry Davis. They were both on the same team, win their silver. And I will tell you, America has had so many golds that those 2 days that by the time Andy got to wrestle in his pool, I think the officials were tired of seeing Americans win. Andy had his guy beaten every way from Sunday, but he didn't get the gold. And that's a little bit like international judging in gymnastics. It happens a little bit in wrestling. And, you know, the interesting thing about that is that you just couldn't talk to Andy about that for years and years and years. In fact, I think that one of the very few times I even talked to him about it was when he was inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. And I finally got another nerve to talk to him about it, but he just couldn't talk about that loss. But here he is, a silver medalist. And I told him 100 times, I said, be proud of what you've accomplished. So few people do. Well, Barry Davis was Andy's assistant. And when Andy left, he was here 7 years, and he left. He accomplished a tremendous amount we'll talk about later. Barry Davis came along and was our coach for 25 years. And as Mike Clevin would tell you, dealing with 18, 19, 20-year-olds for 25 years is a real challenge. But Barry is largely regarded as one of the most exciting young men at the time in wrestling. He was jumping around and he'd run up and down the mats. He was excitable, and he brought a lot of energy and enthusiasm to the Wisconsin program. Barry was a 3-time NCAA champion, 4-time Big Ten champion, was the Big Ten Athlete of the Year in his senior year. He was a silver medalist with Andy in the '84 Olympics. Barry accumulated 127 victories as a Badger head coach and multiple All-Americans and multiple NCAA champions. Is still around, we see him often, and is doing good things in the sport of wrestling. Our latest coach would have been here today. Chris Bono and his assistant, John Reeder, both emailed me yesterday to tell me that they were on their way to Texas to take 2 of our wrestlers who are going to wrestle in the East-West All-Star meet. And by the way, we had a great weekend. Wisconsin beat Cornell in Ithaca, New York, in the Cracker Box field house that they have there, built especially for wrestling. We beat them 19-13, and our 149-pounder beat the 3-time NCAA champion. The guy had won 75 straight matches, and we beat him 9-3. And he's one of the all-stars that will be going to wrestle in the all-star meet. Gomez is his name, and you'll hear a lot about him this year. But Chris Bono would have been here, and so would John Reeder, and they're tremendous guys. Bono built the Chattanooga wrestling program, and he got a lot of claim to fame building North Dakota State, and really was an exceptional wrestler himself, 150-pound national champion. And in addition to all of that, it's just a fantastic promoter of the sport. He's kind of recreated the field house for wrestling. There's mat side seats now. It's a pretty exciting place to be. And I think a little bit like Clevin brought a spark to things. I think we're going to see a lot of good things from Chris Bono and John Reeder, 2 terrific individuals to hit our program up. Well, the first wrestler that became a national champion for the Badgers after all that was Rick Robinger out of Mineral Point, coached by Al Ballman, a famous Wisconsin high school coach. Dwayne had tried to recruit Rick to UW-Madison. And the funny part of that story is that Rick says, no, I'm going to be a Badger. So he comes to Wisconsin, but who else comes to Wisconsin? So the 2 of them joined forces again, And along with Russ Ellison, Rick was on his way. Probably the interesting story about Rick is, and in his senior year, there's one guy he couldn't get by at a weight above what he ultimately won the title for. He just couldn't get by Gerald Hubbard from Michigan. Gave him tremendous matches but couldn't get by him. And so he decided on his own that he was going to cut to 142, which is a weight even below what he wrestled in high school. So he cut from a weight above down to 142 and became a national champion, became our first. Rick was a lovable guy. He was here today, he's smiling the whole lunch. He's just that kind of a fellow. But a fierce competitor and a guy that had great desire to be a champion. Rick still is the 5th winningest wrestler in Wisconsin history, even though in those days he didn't wrestle quite as many matches as they do today. He was a 2-time All-American, 2-time Big Ten champion, and of course, won the title in 1974 to become our first, and always our first, national champion. Hard to talk about Rick without breaking up. He just was a wonderful guy. And we had many good times with him. Well, along from Chardon, Ohio, comes Lee Kemp. And this is probably the greatest wrestler that Wisconsin's ever had. And he's also, in my opinion, my humble opinion, I might add, because I'm not an expert at it, but I would say that in the decade of the 70s and early 80s, he was the most dominant wrestler in American history. He was also, probably in those years, the latter part of the 70s and early 80s, he was the most dominant wrestler in the world. And, you know, unfortunately for Lee, Russ, and Jimmy Haynes, they were all on that Olympic team in '80 that was boycotted. And there again, just like the Andy Ryan story, you can't talk to those guys about that. They worked their life to put the energy in. Lee was a shoe-in world champion, Olympic champion. Nobody had beaten him. Actually, that year he beat the Bulgarian who had been an Olympic champion. He actually beat him, and so he was the odds-on favorite to win it. Russ was right there knocking on the door, might have won the title, and Jimmy Haynes was there as well. But again, hard subject to talk to those guys about. Lee is also, and I'm doing the flip cards. How about this? No, we don't have our pictures. But there's Lee's granite plaque in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame in Stillwater, Oklahoma. You know, just such a special competitor. Wasn't real good at telling time. Used to drive Coach Clevin nuts. He couldn't quite get to practice on time. Every now and again, he'd tell Coach Clevin, well, I'm not going to drill tonight. And Coach said, yeah, if you're drilling just like everybody else, he said, I'm not like everybody else. So he was tough to deal with, but Coach Clevin had a good head on him. He said, I'm just going to stay out of his way. and that's what he did. And probably the biggest thing that happened in Madison was at the Northern Open, was it Lee's sophomore year? Yeah, his sophomore year, Dan Gable thought he was going to come back and make a return to wrestling after being an Olympic champion. And he entered the Northern Open, and sure enough, who would be in the same weight class was Lee Kemp. So I'm at the PA on this particular night that Lee Kemp beats the legendary Dan Gable in our field house at the Northern Open. You know, it was an incredible match. Now, Dan Gable probably wasn't physically at his very best, but, you know, Lee beat him. And Lee was just phenomenal that night. Didn't wear a Wisconsin singlet, he wore his international singlet. And I think the podcast that I did about Lee, I think I heard Wayne Clevin or Russ Helix and say, you know, he may never lose again. Lee Kemp may never lose again. And indeed, I think at one point in time he had 103 wins in a row. He just was unbeatable. Now he lost his freshman year by referee's decision after overtime. So in those years, the referee decided the winner. So they end up after overtime tied with Chuck Yeagler from Iowa. Now, if you were on the east side of the Mississippi, you would say Lee Kemp won. If you're on the west side of the Mississippi, in the terrible black and gold, you would say Chuck Yeagler won. But the fact of the matter is, Lee Kemp really won that match. But it didn't go down that way. So he was denied being the first four-time NCAA champion. We didn't know he was going to win 3 in a row after that. But he did. He told Coach Clevin that he wanted to be a 4-time national champion. And he was so close that night. I could go on and on about Lee Kemp. He won every damn tournament there ever was. He was a 3-time NCAA champion, 3-time world champion, was the odds-on favorite to win the gold in '80, was dominant in his era of time. I think there was no other one. He was in Chardon, Ohio, an adopted young man, had wonderful adopted parents who came to many Badger matches and supported Lee. They warned Coach Clevin ahead of time, best not to argue with Lee because you won't win. And so Coach Clevin took that to heart. So I'm going to move on here to Jack Reinwan. Now, there's an interesting story about Lee Kemp, Jack Reinwan, Pat Christensen, which I'll tell you all about. They all won the national title the same year. In doing so, that was the first time any school had ever had 3 national champions at the NCAA tournament. Now, since then, there have been teams that have had 4 and 5, but at that point in time, no one had ever had 3 champions, and we rattled them off with this guy being the first one at 126 that year. He was at 126 pounds, Jack Reinwan. He was a takedown wizard. Now, Jack was not a dominant high school wrestler. He walked on at Wisconsin, and he was one of those guys that took 4 years to build his acumen to where he was a national champion wrestler. The interesting about him, Jack Reinwan, is in his senior year at the University of Iowa with the Big Ten championships, he was sick, and he placed 4th. So now they go into the seeding meeting to decide who's going to be qualified to go to the nationals. In those years, if you're a 4th, you didn't qualify. But Dan Gable, probably with some coaxing from Dwayne Clevin, although we'll never know that story. But Dan Gable spoke up in the seeding meeting and said, the best guy at this weight is Jack Reinwan. He should go. So Jack ends up at the national tournament and wins it all at 126 pounds. He had a career at Lodi High School as a head coach that was awesome. I think they won something like 24 or 26 conference titles at Lodi. He won a lot of championships in his days at Wisconsin. He was a 2-time All-American. As I told you, NCAA champion. He won the East-West All-Star meet. And Jack is around. You see him a lot. Was a phenomenal high school coach and a great competitor and a phenomenal takedown guy. And when I get to another fellow here, I'll tell you a little bit more about the 2 of them because they were takedown wizards. But that 3rd guy that won the title that same year in '76 was a guy from Oak Creek, Wisconsin, Pat Christensen. And Pat was an okay high school wrestler, not famous, probably not heavily recruited, But Clevin knew his head coach, and the head coach had called Dwayne and said, you know, this is a guy you should consider. I think he's got a lot more potential than he's shown so far. So he walked on at Wisconsin, and he walked into a room, and I say room, that's the wrestling room, that's what we call it, the room. He walked into there with a bunch of just tough guys, really tough guys. And so as Pat would tell you, steel sharpens steel. You know, he just had to get better or you just get run out of the room. You know, oftentimes in practice, that's your hardest wrestling. Sometimes you're just so thankful there's a meet. So you don't have 5 guys, 6 guys a night beating on you. And that was Pat Christensen. And he was a bull, he was very strong. In fact, Lee Kemp has told me that one of the strongest guys he ever wrestled in the room was Pat Christensen. So Pat, he had a kind of a so-so senior year, but he geared up for the national tournament. And as Pat Christensen would tell you if he was here today, he took it one match at a time. I'm going to win this one, and then I'm going to focus on the next one. I'm going to win that. I'm going to focus on the next one, and pretty soon he's in the finals, and he wins the championship. And he beat a guy that he had lost to before. He beat him, so they were split, and Pat won the rubber match to win that and become 1976 and also the triumphant 3, Reinwan, Kemp, and Christensen all winning at the same time. Pat is a legendary executive in Las Vegas. He brings all of the big events to Vegas today. What a wonderful guy he is. He brings in the world champion rodeo. He brings in the IRL. He brings the open wheel racers. He brings in NASCAR. He just does it all in Vegas. He's in their Hall of Fame as a business person. He was an assistant coach at UNLV for a period of time before he took over running the Kimax, the Mac facility. And now today he's got his own company and manages all of these events. Well, in 1977, along came a guy by the name of Jimmy Haynes out of Arcadia, Wisconsin. And Jimmy was a 118-pounder and a minute sort of a fellow, not very big, but awfully tough. But again, like Jack Reinwan, he hadn't really matured as a wrestler yet. And so, as Clevin would probably tell you if he was up here, you know, it would have maybe Reinwan and Haynes might not have, if he could, they might not have made a team when they came as a freshman. But they stuck it out. He had some second practices for some of these guys, 2 practices a night, brought them along, and with the tutelage of Clevin holding their hand and Russ Ellington giving him some technique, over time, these 2 guys developed and developed and developed to be the greatest takedown wrestlers Wisconsin's ever had. And the opposing coaches just hated to start a duel at Wisconsin. With Jimmy Haynes coming out, he'd take you down 10, 12 times. Jeff Reinwan would take you down 10, 12, 14 times. They would just take down wizards. And Jimmy Haynes becomes a champion in 77. But an interesting story about Jimmy Haynes. Jimmy lost the Big Ten title in our field house. Again, I'm at the PA mic. Kind of an emotional moment. He just couldn't get out from underneath, being on the mat, couldn't escape, get on his feet from a guy by the name of Mike MacArthur from Minnesota. MacArthur was a tough dude, and Jimmy just couldn't escape from him, so he lost the Big Ten title. Devastated. He was devastated. What most people don't know is he ran around the stadium, the field house, until wee hours in the morning. He had a key, went up in the wrestling room, and slept all night in the wrestling room. He met up with Russ sometime on Sunday, and Russ sent him home. Now, Clevin doesn't know this. So he sent him home. He slept in the wrestling room all night. married at the time to be, and, but he sleeps in the wrestling room, he's devastated. And Russ just immediately knew that he was not in any condition to come to practice. So he sent him home to Arcadia, said, go fishing and hunting. So Clevin comes to practice on Monday, where's Haynes? Well, I sent him home. What? We've got 7-8 days for the national tournament, you sent him home? Yeah, he wasn't in any condition to wrestle. So Haynes comes back on a Wednesday, I think it was, and he comes up and coach said, well, did you have a good time in Arcadia? And yeah, I'm all right, coach. Good, you're with Russ for the rest of the week. Now, Russ is a 220-pound gorilla. I mean, forearms like this, and little Jimmy Haynes. But Russ coached Jimmy on how to get out from underneath Mike MacArthur. So if luck would have it, you get to the national tournament, here's MacArthur in one bracket, and here's Haynes in another, and as luck would have it, they meet in the finals. They get out there, first thing out of the bat, MacArthur takes Haynes down. And Haynes' thought is, what the hell is this? I'm the guy that's supposed to get takedowns, and I'm being taken down. But he uses Russ's maneuver, escapes, now he's got new confidence, and he beats MacArthur. I think the score was 7-6, so it was close. Is that right? 7-6, I think it was. So that's the story about Jimmy Haynes. And these things all come out in podcasts that I've been doing with these guys. Interesting stories about what's happened. Jimmy Haynes out of Arcadia, Wisconsin, becomes a national champion in '77. Well, along comes a big guy by the name of Ron Yaite. And Ron Yaite was from Fenimore, Wisconsin, and Clevin had gotten a tip from Al Bauman, his friend who was coaching in Mineral Point, said, you ought to take a look at this guy. Well, he's not on the radar screen. We're not looking at him. Well, I think you should go look at him, says Al Bauman. So Clevin drives to Fenimore and he sees Ron Yaite loading bales of hay in his wrestling shoes. And then when they get done loading bales of hay, he's wrestling his brother in these wrestling shoes. And Clevin says, you know, if a guy's gonna bale hay in his wrestling shoes and then wrestle after he does about 1,200 loads of hay, I think he might be a prospect. So Clevin recruits him. Now, those that were in the room during the Ron Yaite years would tell you they wanted to wear pads on their ankles because Ron had like 14 size feet and he had a foot sweep that he would use like so, and he would literally take you to the mat with that foot sweep. And you know, the guys in practice said, you know, we thought he was gonna break our ankles. But Ron came into the room, much like Pat Christensen, he came in with a bunch of really tough, big guys. And so as Ron would tell you the story, I either had to get better or I didn't run right out of the room. There was just no room to be in there as a so-so wrestler. So again, it took Ron 4 years to meet his ultimate time as being a national champion. So Ron wins the title and becomes a national champion. And he's another one of those guys, if he was here tonight, in the day, he would be smiling all the way. He's just a happy-go-lucky guy. And he's a true Badger champion for sure. Well, along comes Andy Ryan next. And I try to stay on time here, but I got a few more to do. Andy Ryan was, as I told you, the coach at Wisconsin for a period of time. He actually coached from '87 to '93 out of Stoughton. And I think if Coach Clevin were doing this today, he would tell you that he's probably the most outstanding Wisconsin high school product that ever wrestled for the Badgers. He was dominant again in his time, a great thrower, but on ring. Then I always kid Andy when I see him, I said, you're such a nice guy, but you were an on-ring sucker on the mat, and he was. He gave no quarter. An interesting story about Andy is that he's second, he wins second. So his junior year coach, I think he was second. Sophomore year, he was second. Then he was injured his junior year and he placed like sixth. So he's a three-time All-American. Come his senior year, Andy goes 40-0, but prior to that, he's wrestling a guy by the name of Greg Horswell, who's from Madison West, where Greg wrestled, my son wrestled at West. He's from Madison West, a wonderful family, the Horswell family. And Greg wrestled in a lighter weight than Andy. And one night after practice, they're leaning against the mat, kind of exhausted. And Greg Horswell tells him, he says, you know, Andy, you should be a national champion. He said, I wrestle a lot of tough guys, but there's no one tougher than you. You just beat the living crap out of me every damn night at practice. You should be a national champion. And Andy went home that night, and this is a true story, I heard it from Andy. He went home that night and he started building his list of what he had to do to become a national champion. So he enters his senior year and he goes 40-0 and wins the title. And he was hurt when he won the title. He had bad ribs, but he wins the title in Oregon State, right? At Oregon State is where he won the title. I have to look at Clevin once in a while. He'll critique me afterwards and say, you missed this and you missed that. But that's why he's the coach, you know. And he reminded me of that several times as well. So Andy wins the silver medal, as I told you earlier, in LA. Sandy and I watched every match in the hurdling final match that he ends up not winning the gold, but winning the silver. But a great accomplishment. Then he was a three-time All-American. He was on a lot of international teams. Just a phenomenal guy. And then as a coach, he racked up 81 dual meet victories for the Badgers in his time here. He was the rookie coach of the year in the NCAA. And Andy is now in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. And his plaque, as I showed you earlier, his granite plaque is on display in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Along comes Jim Jordan at 134 pounds. And Jim Jordan is the congressman from Ohio. He actually serves in the 8th District of Ohio as their congressman. He just won a landslide vote again. He was unstoppable in his junior and senior years. He beat a two-time, we didn't know it then, but he beat a two-time Olympic champion, a six-time world champion, John Smith, who's now one of the prominent coaches in America at Oklahoma State. He beat him as a junior year, and in his senior year, he beats a guy from Iowa to win it 2 years in a row at 134 pounds. Those of us that really know him well think he's just a great human being, a great American, and thank God he's serving us in Congress. California guy by the name of David Lee comes along. David wins the title, NCAA title for the Badgers at 165 pounds. He was the first three-time California state champion. They have no classes in California. So you wrestle all of California when you wrestle. And he's in the California Hall of Fame as the first three-time champion. He won it at 138. He wrestled at 159 and won it, and then he won it at 165 pounds. He went to Stanford, and there he met up with Dave Schultz, who kind of followed Lee Kemp in the world rankings of wrestling, and won a gold medal. Dave Schultz, you probably remember, was killed by John DuPont in the driveway at the Foxcatcher Training Center. Tragic story. A beloved guy in wrestling. And he was an assistant at Stanford when David Lee entered that school. And when Andy Ryan hired Schultz to be an assistant, David Lee came with him. I will say this, as somebody who's admired Wisconsin wrestling for years, I would say he was one of the smoothest wrestlers we ever had. He wasted no moves. He was just smooth. He was confident. You just kind of knew he was going to win all along. And he was a dominant wrestler. He wraps homes. Today he wraps homes, and then they do the construction in California in the bad weather, and he wraps, shrink wraps. And that's what he does today. And then he spent 6 months in Bali surfing. So he's a California surfer, doing pretty well, I would say. And another one of those smart guys that are so common in Wisconsin wrestling. Matt Demaray was another kind of similar style type of fellow as David Lee. And Matt Demaray came to Wisconsin, two-time NCAA champion at 150 pounds in 91 and 92. Matt Demaray was a scholar as well. He ended up getting his MBA at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Business. Matt has 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and is just a phenomenal individual today, just as he was when he wrestled. He was the Medal of Honor in the Big Ten for both athletics and academics. And so he was Andy Ryan's graduate assistant for a time, and then he went off in industry, and today is a very successful individual. Jeff Walter, who came out of Pennsylvania, was the only Big Ten heavyweight, well, was the only national champion heavyweight we've ever had. We've had a couple of guys early on in the Martin years and before that got to the finals in the NCAA, but Jeff Walter got it done. And I will tell you, I was on the floor at the Target Center in Minneapolis when he won. My son-in-law was shooting video. Walter had lost to nearly all of the Big Ten runners at that time at heavyweight. And so one of the first matches he had was Billy Pierce from Minnesota. Billy had beaten him a couple of times. Jeff Walter beats him. Then he has a guy who is honorier than Andy Ryan, actually, Tony Vaughn from Purdue, big barrel-chested, big man. And Jeff Walter was not a big heavyweight, and so he tangles with Tony Vaughn, and Tony had beaten him in the duel here. Walters beats him in the nationals in the semis. So now he has to wrestle a big guy from North Carolina, Justin Hardy. Half bald at the time, big fellow, huge heavyweight. Coached by Bill Lamb, a friend of Coach Clevens and mine. He comes down to flip the coin in overtime. And Jeff Walter will tell you he was here because he told me. So I looked at the sky and said, "Please, Lord, give him a break. Let me go down." And the coin came up, and he got the choice, and he took down, escaped from Justin Hardy, and wins the national title. Jeff is a medical guy. He deals with vision issues, balance. He's out in Cumberland at a hospital, big rural hospital. He and his wife Gretchen have 2 daughters and a son. He was just at the Cornell match in Ithaca, New York. Saw pictures of him on Facebook, wrote him a note. Says, "Good to see the champ in the house." 2 last guys, and I'll wrap it up quickly here for you. Donnie Prislap, who's now the assistant coach at Rutgers in the Big Ten, was a 2-time national champion for us out of New Jersey. I'll never forget, I grabbed a hold of him at the national tournament, and he was like grabbing a hold of a piece of steel. He was just ripped and strong, and you just couldn't penetrate. He was that strong. 2-time national champion at 165. Would have probably been Barry Davis's successor at Wisconsin, but He was impatient and jumped the ship and went to Michigan, not a good move on his part. And then he went to Rutgers, where he's had some success as an assistant coach. And a good guy. And I've got an upcoming podcast with Donnie Pritzlaff, who won the title for the Badgers 2 successive years. He's a 3-time Big Ten champion, 3rd in the world champions in freestyle, 4-time All-American for Wisconsin. The final guy, Andrew Howe at the time, comes to us out of the high school class of 08. Andrew ends up in the national finals as a freshman. Hard to do. And he ends up 2nd that year, loses to a guy by the name of King from Edinburgh. Sophomore year, he was undefeated. He wins the Big Ten championship and wins the national title for the Badgers. Junior year, he lost to a guy by the name of Caldwell. Then he transfers to Oklahoma. Not a pleasant thought for those of us that are Badger fans, but he goes to Oklahoma. He sits out 2 years, wrestles internationally, comes back, and his senior year, he's 24 years old. He loses to Chris Perry from Oklahoma State, lost him in the Big Ten, or Big 12 finals, and then lost him in the national finals. 4-time All-American. He won 2 All-Americans in Wisconsin, 3 in Wisconsin, and 1 in Oklahoma. And 24 years old when he finished his career. Those are the illustrious national champions for Wisconsin. And I will tell you one thing that is resonant about all of them is that they're just very good young men. And they're smart, intelligent, and that's the kind of people that the wrestling team seems to recruit. Kids that want to get a good academic education as well as being outstanding wrestlers. So I'm sorry I ran just a little long, but I knew it was going to be tough. I timed it about 4 times. It's just too much to talk about. There's too much excitement, and I hope that you're a little bit excited about it. If I kept you awake, that's great. And Coach Clevin, thanks for being here. Greg, thanks for being here. And as always, Sandy, I love you. All right.
Terry, thanks so much. We gave you a little bit of slack because of the slow start, because of the AV issues. So thanks everyone in the audience for hanging tight. I don't think we're gonna run too long, but I do want Corky to come up. She is doing our moment of reflection.
Okay. I found some humorous sayings about Thanksgiving. Irma Bombeck says, I come from a family where gravy is considered a beverage. PJ O'Rourke said, Thanksgiving is so called because we are thankful it comes only once a year. Jimmy Fallon said, a new survey found that 80% of men claim they help cook Thanksgiving dinner, which makes sense when you hear them consider saying, that smells good, to be helping. Barney Stinson, who connected with How I Met Your Mother. The Thankssteenie, a fun and delicious new novelty drink I invented. Cranberry juice, potato vodka, and a bouillon cube. Tastes just like a turkey dinner. And somebody wrote, coexistence, what a farmer does with the turkey until Thanksgiving.
Thanks, Corky. If anyone else has announcements, why don't you?
I'll just end here, say that we served a meal at the Braxton Street Apartments last Monday. John Esser and Michael Ely helped, and, food truck, Holy Cow Food Truck was there with Italian beef and a nice salad. And, I think we served around 35 people. I'm looking forward to having our home serving a meal, and bringing the own serving it in January, I think.
Great. Anyone else? Jerry?
Need one more person to do registration either on the second or the third shift for the blood drive on December 1st. So if you're interested, you can go to the website or talk to me after the meeting. Thank you.
Any other announcements? Okay, the only announcement I have is we're having the club board meeting right after this meeting. So if anyone wants to join the board meeting, you're always welcome. Otherwise.
Leave them alone.